Hello everyone, so welcome once again. So let's proceed on implementing the repository and services and wiring them together for the user module in our e-commerce API. So the next place we go now is in our user module here. We come to our user module.ts and this module is I would say it is where we have the providers array where the dependency injection wiring lives, and it provides the user repository token, and this is the implementation where we can actually use to switch databases and also ensure that we have our user module wired. So let's proceed. So import module from at NestJS common, then Mongoose module, import Mongoose module. Okay, so we then have to import our user and user schema, user and user schema from where do we have that? User and user schema. Interesting. So we then from schema, yes, user.schema. We then have to do what? Import our Mongo user repository. But since we don't have that yet, we have to implement our Mongo user repository. Let's jump to that, where we have to implement the contracts that we have in the interface. So we have to import injectable from at NestJS common. Then we have to import inject model, yes. We then have to import model from Mongoose, we then have to import our iUser repository so that we ensure everything is implemented. iUser repository, yes. We then have to import our user entity, yes. We then have to import our user and user documents, from schemas dot user.schema. Is that where we have it? Here is our user and user documents, yes. Okay. Schemas dot user, let's check. Cannot find module. Schemas, no, that is wrong. Okay, so then I have to do at injectable. Then we then have to proceed by exporting class Mongo user repository. Implement to tell us that it implements the iUser repository, which means every method or function here needs to align with what we have in our iUser repository. So at inject model user.name private, to make it private, use user model which is the model user documents. So as you can see, it says it incorrectly implements interface iUser repository because a lot of the methods that are needed is not there. So this is one of the interesting parts of it. So private toEntity, we have to convert the Mongoose data or model data into an entity, or the Mongoose documents. User documents, it takes in the user document and we convert it to an entity to return ID, which is what? doc.id .toString. Yes. Then what's next? We then have last name, which doc.last name is the doc.last. I didn't ask you for this. I'm not asking for documents. Why are you completing this for me? Last name. Yes. Then let's do our first name. Function is missing immediately following declaration. Okay. Let's proceed. Oh, this like returns the user entity. Sorry. Returns the user entity. So let's proceed. Let's just copy this so we can update it for first name. First name doc.first name. Then we have email. Email should be doc.email. Then we also have password. Password, which is the doc.password. We also have our refresh token, which is doc.refresh token. We also have our role, which is doc.role. What else? This. we also have our created at, which is doc, or let's say doc as any doc created at. We need to also have updated at, also same pattern, dot updated at. So there is an issue with our refresh token. Let's go back to our entity. So for our refresh token, yes, it is string. Then we have to identify so, and for our schemas, let's check for our schemas. Yes. Is on type user entity. It says it is undefined, but before we even proceed, I think we have to identify why this is problematic. So refresh token, undefined is not able to type string. Okay, so in our iUser repository, let's check our schemas. We have our refresh token. In our repositories, we have this. In our entities, we have refresh token to be type as string. Yes, so this was the issue. Yeah. Okay, so let's proceed. Since we now have our private.toEntity, we then have to implement our repository methods. So data type was inconsistent, which is why it showed errors for us. We have to define async findById, and automatically it gives us what we need. Then we do const doc is what awaits this dot user model dot findById, yes, id dot select plus password plus refresh token, then dot exec. What else? Then it returns doc this dot toEntity doc or null. So we've defined our findById. We then have to do find with sensitive, async findById with sensitive. Automatically it gives us that. So we then have to just copy this to make it faster. findById. So yeah. So let's proceed. So we then have to do find by email. So the reason why we have to do find by email and password is because when a user is coming to authenticate with their username and password, we need to be able to find them by email, and they are stripped before the entity leaves the service layer. So const, so let's just do find by email. Find by email, automatically it fills that up for us. So const query is what? This user dot user model dot find one. Yes, find for the email. This should not be okay. Then we don't have to do if with sensitive. This has to be in invoice. If with sensitive, we then do query dot select. We extend our query. Let's just pick this. Then we then say const doc is equal to await query dot exec. So as such, right, when we are finding by ID, right, or let's say when we have our is sensitive, when we're finding by ID, this is wrong, sorry. When we're finding by ID, we do not really need, in cases where we do not really need, how would I call it? We do not really need to validate aside from ID, but we want to validate based on their password and their refresh token. So that is when we need this find by ID with sensitive. And for our find by email, and when we use case with sensitive, right, that means we want to actually validate their email along with their password and the refresh token. So query.exec, then we say return doc this dot toEntity doc and or null. Okay, so that is for find by email. We still have about 3 different methods. So if we check, right, it says we still have 3 different methods: create, update, and delete. Okay, so let's proceed. Async create. So you then say const doc is equal to await this dot user model dot find by oh sorry, we are creating model dot create, and we create that with our data. Then we say return this dot to entity, then the doc. We then have our updates, which we are taking our ID and data. So for us to update, we first have to fetch the document for that user. Await this dot user model dot find. We have to find by ID and updates. ID, then data, and we have to pass new true. We have to do dot select, password, refresh token, dot exec. Okay, this is wrong here. We then have to do return the doc, this dot to entity doc, or what null. So we have our last method here, which is delete. So we then do const result is equal to await this dot user model dot find by ID and delete ID dot exec return. We are returning it like this to say it checks that did this actually delete, which would default to true if it deletes, and returns false if it does not delete. So that is that for our Mongo user repository that takes in the interface. So, and from that, we are going to be moving to our user module. But before we move to our user module, I would say let's proceed with our user service. User service. So this would also import. So our user service, I would say, implement like connects to our repositories, right? To then connect to, like, let's say, other parts of our code base, like the domain layer and so on and so forth. So we have injectable from at nest common. Then we then have to import our user repository. Then our user repository token. From this is actually injectable. From our domain interfaces, yes. domain no domain interfaces repositories, our user repository, so we then have to do import then have to do import user entity from the domain. This is wrong. So after we import user entity, import logger service from SRT utils logger service. Okay, so this is wrong, or not really wrong, but syntactic. So we then have to decorate this with the injectable, and we export the user service class. Export class user service, and we have this as constructor. At inject, user repository token, private read-only, user repository, user repository, and private read-only logger. We are wiring our user repository and logger, only logger, then that is the logger service, and we then get this. Okay, this is actually exporting. That was an error. So we then have to define async findById, which taking id as string, then what else? It returns like a promise of omit user entity, password, refresh token, or null. So const user is equal to await this dot user repository dot findById, passing the ID, and if not user, return null. But if the user exists, const password, refresh token in safe format, that is equal to the user, and then return the safe format of that. Okay, so we then have find all safe, find all async, find all safe, which we then have id as a string, this .logger .debug, then we have looking up user, id in user service, then return this dot findById with the ID. User service. So we then have to identify why this is this way. We have our iUser repository. We have this. We imported our iUser repository and our user repository token from our domain interfaces, repositories, users repository. We also imported user entity. But now isolated modules and emit decorator metadata. So let's try to disable our isolated modules. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay, so our isolated modules was the reason why we had that error. So now that we already have our Mongo user repository, our user service, we then need to wire our user module provider. We then have to conclude our user module provider wiring. So now we have to import the Mongo user repository. Okay, then after that we have to import our user service. After that we have to import what next? Our we have to import our users repository token. Okay. So, but before we proceed now, we would have to implement our user controller so that we can wire all of them together. So, and on this instance, we would have done most of the implementation for our user module. Import controller get use guards from at NestJS common import API bearer auth from NestJS Swagger. We also need to import API operation. We also need to import our API tags. Yes. We then have to import. No, that was wrong. Then have to import our user service. We then have to import our JWT auth card. Why is this happening? Import our JWT auth card. From I think for now we'll need our JWT auth guard from. I don't think we have it implemented yet, but at this point I think we would have to implement our JWT auth guard. So inside guards, let's implement our JWT auth guards.ts. So we then have to do imports injectable from at NestJS common. Then we then have to import auth guard from at NestJS passport. Yes. Then we then have to do our at injectable, then export class our JWT auth guard, which will extend our auth guard JWT. So, and in guards, we would also need our roles guard so that we can start setting up our role-based roles.guards.ts. Okay. Well, let me just use guard instead of guards. Roles.guard.ts. Import can activate from this. We also need execution context and injectable. We then have to import reflector. From at NestJS core. NestJS core We then have to import role. From our domain. Then our entities, our user.entity, yes. We then have to import roles key. Before we implement our roles key for now, let's have this. Let's ignore this for now and let's proceed with wiring our user module. So we are going to import our user controller later. But before we do that, let's wire it up. Module. We then have our import as Mongoose module. Dot forward feature. Name. User.name. Schemas, which is our user schema. Then it is where we are supposed to have our controllers, but let's even add it for now so that we can just stop it, which we are going to comment out. This is where we are going to have our users controller, even though we don't have it yet. But let's comment that out for now, for when we have it. This should be our schema, not schemas. Okay. So we then have to do our providers. Yes. Which is our user repository token. But before we have that, let's do this. Ensure we have it in the list. User repository token. What else? This we have to provide this. Provide our user repository token. Yeah. Then use class Mongo user repository. Then we then have our user service here. We then say export what? Export our user repository token and user service. Then we export the entire class. Export the entire class, which we are going to call our users module. So just to add, right, we have our DI token wiring, and we are going to like maybe touch on like the reason why we had to strip sensitive fields, right, when we get there, but we'll see in the next video.